Ready to go?
And talk about a whole 3 pages? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Welcome back to another episode of Is Fitz Happy? I'm Luke.
And I'm Emma.
We're discussing the third book today. We're starting Assassin's Quest.
Whoop, whoop, whoop.
On the prologue, right where it begins, of course. We've had a nice little break. You know, took a week off.
Mm-hmm.
We had somewhat of a vacation. Warm weather and beaches, so I'm ready to dive back in to the misery of Fitz's life.
Yep.
This is the prologue, The Unremembered. And of course, it's of quote-unquote old Fitz when he's, I don't know, probably 28, 29, maybe 30, something like that, after the events of this book and after he gets Hap from Starling.
Yes.
He's pretty much reminiscing and talking about, you know, the events of the previous book and giving us a recap because that's the thing that happens at the beginning of these books.
Yeah.
And all books, pretty much.
Yeah. Just in case somebody decides to start on the third book of a trilogy, you got to let them know what they missed.
It always annoyed me. These ones, they recap a little bit different because it's a different perspective. A first person, like in the moment perspective of what's happening versus like, oh, I was so young back then perspective of 30-year-old Fitz looking back on the memories.
Right. Back when I had a young person's body.
Right.
Yeah. So this prologue starts off talking about how Fitz has just woken up with ink all over his face because he's fallen asleep writing again. That this is something he does quite often, is write so far into the night that he's falling asleep. He mentions his boy, which we know to be Hap, but the reader who would be reading this for the first time would not know.
When I was reading this the first time, I expected him to like have a kid with somebody at the end of this book.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that does happen, kind of.
Not at the end of this book, really.
No, but he does have a kid by the end of the book.
Right. I mean, he gets Hap.
No, Nettle.
Well, yeah, I suppose. But a boy. I was talking about like, he was have like a baby boy kind of thing.
I guess, sure.
Yeah.
So he talks a little bit about how his boy will chide him for not taking himself to bed earlier most of the time, but sometimes something in his face makes the boy stop and not say anything. And he describes it as it's just something that all men need to learn. I do not try to explain to him why I do as I do. It is not a secret one can give to a younger man. It is one he must earn and learn on his own. A man must have purpose in his life.
And Fitz is pretty broken during this, and we know that he's given some of his feelings and memories to Girl and a Dragon at this point, has not gotten them back. So I consider him, you know, partially forged, I guess. I don't know if that's the correct term for it, but it's a lot of his bad feelings gone, so a lot of his joy in life is gone as well, and he feels like he has no purpose.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of sitting here, and that's not just from giving his feelings to Girl on a Dragon either.
Right.
But it's kind of enhanced that feeling in him, I think. And he talks about having to look for a purpose, that every person needs a purpose, and not really having one, so he's fallen back and taken up Fedrin's and Lady Patience's suggestion of writing down a history of the Six Duchies.
Right.
Which often meanders and goes into personal things, as we know.
This is also the start of his habit of writing all of the time, all of the intricacies of his life. We know that he does this for the rest of his life. Although later in life he starts burning everything after writing it. I think he keeps very few things.
I think he is burning stuff now too. Especially like the pages of history that delve into personal things.
Sure, yeah.
But
I do know that some of them are not burned though, because in the next Fitz trilogy, he worries about some of the scrolls being found because he left them behind. So that tells me that not every single one gets burned.
No, he doesn't burn everything. I don't think he ever burns everything, because sometimes he is proud of like what he does and he sends them off to Chade.
Right.
Like, and he doesn't know if Chade's going to read the history that he's writing or anything like that. He's just kind of sending these things off and like, this is acceptable work. And I think sometimes he just toes the line and falls asleep and doesn't. His boy cleans up and he doesn't manage to burn everything at the end. But he does talk about him trying to write this history, try to write the coherent story to distract himself. And he also takes breaks because he can't focus on that long thing at one time. So he does smaller treatises and observations on cultures and magic and political structures and things like that. Eventually, when the pain is the worst from his skill cravings or from his body or whatever, he just works on translations which require not much thought. So he's very distractible. He's trying to escape a lot of his mind right now and just delve into something just like Verity did with map making.
Right. Which I find an interesting likeness, I guess, that he's giving to himself in Verity. It's interesting to me because I guess I never viewed Verity making maps as a way to escape pain until reading it through Fitz's perspective. Although we don't know that Fitz is right. It is a skewed perspective, but it is cool to think about it that way, that maybe Verity was so obsessed with maps so that he could get away from his own skill problems. Although I don't think it started as that for him at the very least.
I agree. I think he genuinely did like making maps beforehand.
Which I guess is true to Fitz as well. He genuinely liked being someone who could be a scribe's assistant. Yeah. He thought at one point that would be his job for life, which would be a pretty cool job if you ask me. But yeah, it's just a really interesting parallel between the two. And I do wonder a little bit about it maybe being a stretch because he kind of sees Verity as a father figure. So maybe he's trying to be like, oh, just like my dad in some roundabout way. I'm not sure that that's true, but it made me think a little bit that it could be.
Yeah, definitely. As I mentioned before, Fitz is in a very broken place in his life. I feel that he thinks he's content, that he thinks this is what he always wanted and what he kind of deserves in a twisted way.
Sure.
But at the same time, reading between the lines and knowing what we know happens later, he is an incredibly broken place and doesn't really know, hasn't really fixed or addressed any of the emotional issues he had before.
Right.
Because again, he still says here, like, as he's writing down these histories and it delves closer into personal things, he has to confront his past, who he was and who he is becoming. And part of that is like, oh, I had people that, really loved me and friends and everything, more so than I deserved. And it just very self-pitying talk of like, yeah, people actually cared for me, but they shouldn't have. And I'm just here alone in my cabin with my boy.
There were good times, but there were way more bad times.
Yeah. Which, to be is kind of fair for Fitz.
Although a little bit biased because we are only getting Fitz's life story through his lens. Yeah. So, but if that's how he feels, that's valid.
Yet I possess perhaps a greater share of dark memories than most men. Few men have known death in a dungeon or can recall the inside of a coffin buried beneath the snow. The mind shies away from the details of such things. And he still has PTSD from a lot of these events that has happened in his life, or at least nightmares and memories resurfacing that affect him still, 10 years after those events.
Right. And he says just thinking of the eyes of the men who beat him up causes his gut to run ice cold. And there's just still so much fear there. And it's really sad because, that's such a hard thing to deal with. And what happened to him was really, really horrible. And it just makes me so sad for him that there are lasting effects that don't really ever fully go away.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And then he talks about how it's also not just a literal death in the dungeon, but it killed FitzChivalry as a person. And we've discussed this before, Emma, like last episode, I think, how him dying killed him in the eyes of the entire Six Duchies.
Exactly.
And so he can't go back to who he was. And so he says in here, I was never again commonly known as FitzChivalry. I never renewed bonds to the Buckkeep folk who had known me since I was a child of 6. I never lived in Buckkeep Castle again, never more waited on the Lady Patience, never sat on the hearthstones at Chade's feet again. Lost to me were the rhythms of life that had intertwined with mine. Friends died, others were wed, babes were born. Children came of age, and I saw none of it. Though I no longer possess the body of a healthy young man, many still live who once called me friend. Sometimes, still, I long to rest eyes on them, to touch hands, to lay to peace the loneliness of years. I cannot. Which we know isn't all true. A lot of that is true at the moment, but he is like 30-ish.
Yeah.
So that happens again, but he is never known commonly as FitzChivalry again until the last trilogy.
Right. I also...
And that for, 2 years maybe?
Maybe. Yeah. And I just think it's so sad to think about life this way. Like, I'm never going to be who I was ever again. But it does make me wonder if Robin Hobb wrote it this way so that this could potentially be actually Old Man Fitz, just in case she never wrote any more or got published for any more of the series.
Possibly.
So that, if she never came back to Fitz, we had a closure of, oh, well, he had a boy at some point.
Right.
He became Chade. But yeah, I don't know. It is really sad. And this is part of the thing that keeps him mad at Regal. Just that Regal took this away from him and he gave Regal this victory, which is not how he should be thinking of it. But understandably, he does think of it that way.
And we see how he can't move on from these events. He's always thinking in the past. And that, I really do think, is a result of him putting those memories into Girl on a Dragon.
Yeah.
I've made it clear before that having those bad memories, I think that having those bad memories shoved away into something else and then receiving them later just locked him in that state at that period of time. He never had the chance to, dull those memories over the years or smooth over the cracks or fix anything or get over any of his emotions. It was all kind of locked in that period, and he still had memories of, what had happened and his reactions, but didn't feel the emotions to them. So he never got better from those events, from Molly, from his abandonment of his mother, from his anger, from the pain of the dungeons, anything like that. So he can't move on. He can't move forward with his life until that happens. Right.
Because taking away part of the pain doesn't allow you to fully heal
or confront it in any way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really do think a lot of the tone we get from this prologue is because of that. It's all reflecting on what had happened in the past and nothing about, maybe I can make new friends in the future or have, my boy be my family. No, it's just my boys here are cleaning up, and I left all my life behind.
Right.
And I do want to comment quick before we move on that he says, I no longer possess the body of a healthy young man. He doesn't. He has a ton of pains and everything from that. I think his white shock of hair is from the beating in the dungeon, getting kicked in the head or something like that. But he does get healed later in life, and in the Tawny Man trilogy.
Yeah.
But they go overboard, so he like always has the body of a healthy man, not necessarily young, but always the body of a healthy man to the detriment of his health.
Yes.
Sometimes, which I thought it's kind of interesting because I hadn't thought about his whole physical health over the span of the whole series yet. And the first part of it is him being, you know, a kid getting healthy and hale, and then just him struggling through the pains as like a 30-year-old person, 30-year-old to 40-year-old man, being old beyond his years, and then at the end of that being healed to always be at like 35 but healthy for the rest of his years.
Yeah, it's super interesting to think about his health, and I've never thought of him, even in the beginning of the Tawny Man trilogy, as particularly like trapped in an older body, or that his pains were that significant.
Right.
Because I think he's still able to function day to day, and he's able to like chop wood and farm for food and stuff.
Yeah, he definitely is.
So I think it's a little bit of Fitz being a drama queen.
I mean, when is it not?
Right. I don't know. I think he may still suffer from a little bit of shaking, sort of the same as the seizure sickness in him, but I don't think that it's ever truly as bad as it was when he was in his teens and first ailing from it. Although he does get horrible headaches from using the skill, and we know that he does use the skill a lot. I'm sure it's not like an easy life by any means, but...
And that's from his broken skull, I think, pressing.
Right.
Because once that's healed, he doesn't have any pain.
Right, yeah. No, it's just really interesting to hear him talk about how I no longer have a youthful body as he's chopping wood every day.
He's so in his head about that. Mm-hmm. And very caught up, because I think that's kind of descendant from Byrric's point of view and who he was raised with.
Sure, yeah.
Verity was always like the soldier do-it-yourself kind of person. Byrric was too, but he had an injury that crippled his leg. Mm-hmm. And dealt with it poorly, that Fitz saw growing up.
Right.
And heard all the talk from other people saying, oh yeah, he was such a man to contend with before this happened, you know?
Before the incident.
Right. So I'm wondering if it's kind of residual, like, oh, I'm not in the prime anymore. I'm kind of crippled. I'm not.
Right. He has that to go off of. So.
Yeah. I don't know. Just wanted to point that out because I hadn't really thought about that before, or thinking about his health over the span of everything, because most of the time we're just thinking about what is happening.
Yeah, true.
But anyways, Fitz then goes on to speak about how those years, his past is lost to him, and that it couldn't have been more than a month from when he was in the dungeon to when he died, even though it seemed like an eternity. And how, like, from when his king had died into his arms to when he died, he missed everything in between that. He missed his king's burial. He missed himself being sentenced with the wit because he had died before that.
Right.
He just missed out on significant portions of his life that are affecting him.
Yeah.
And will continue to affect him.
And he also mentions that he phrases it very interestingly, that when he is found guilty of using the wit, it is used to make his death something he deserved.
Right.
It's justified. Then people don't feel bad. In the eyes of
everybody else.
Yeah, that the court is okay with it now. And I think that's also something that I don't know a better way to phrase this, but hurts his feelings. A little bit more serious than it sounds, but it would hurt that there's all these people who are willing to basically be traitors for you and just a few weeks later are grateful that you died and don't feel bad about the horrible death you have endured because you maybe used the wit, which
Right.
there is no actual proof of, just some people saying they saw it, which I guess technically is proof of some type, but not nobody saw Fitz use it himself. So I don't know. It is really sad.
The last part of this prologue here is him once again going over the last few events and specifically who they involved. So Patience and Lacey were the only ones to claim his body. Patience, cleaned his wounds, wrapped them up, and he makes a point to write down here that she claimed his body even though she was so distressed, first of all, when she found out that Fitz was Chivalry's kid. She was still the one to come and claim him, to care for him, make sure he got a proper burial and everything like that.
To treat him as gently as though he were still alive.
She and Lacey, her woman, mourned me when all others, out of fear or disgust at my crime, abandoned me. Yet she knew nothing of how Burek and Chade, my assassin mentor, came nights later to that grave, and dug away the snow that had fallen, and the frozen clumps of earth that had been tossed down on my coffin. Only those two were present as Burek broke through the lid of the coffin and tugged out my body, and then summoned by his own wit magic the wolf that had been entrusted with my soul. And she doesn't know. She doesn't find out until, 7 books from now, I guess. Because we have to go through Assassin's Quest yet.
Yes. Yeah, it's really sad to think about, and more sad because Fitz purposely keeps his distance from her. After this, which is crazy to me, like, she risked so much to give him a proper burial, and he won't even give her the courtesy of letting her know, hey, I made it.
It's dangerous. That's what he's told, and that's what he thinks. So,
well, yeah, but when has Patience ever cared about the danger of anything?
That's why Fitz does not go to her.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. It just makes me so sad for Patience, I think. Especially, it's heartbreaking because we're told Fitz looks so much like his father, and to lose the love of your life, and then a few years later your adopted son that looks just like the love of your life,
right?
Like, you're burying him twice, and that's so sad.
Yeah,
I feel very sorry for her. And you know what, she should have given Fitz more crap about it. He deserved more, but I get it. She was just happy he was alive.
I do want to point out one thing at the end here and ask you what you think about it. The whole last 2 sentences is, perhaps, as the fool insists, they had no choice, being Burek and Chade. Perhaps there can be no thanks nor any blame, but only recognition of the forces that brought us and bound us to our inevitable fates. So Fitz is saying, maybe, I don't know if I've forgiven Chade and Burek for bringing me back to life, putting me back in a man's body. But maybe, as the fool says, they had no choice, which is really weird to me because the fool's whole thing is any little choice can affect the future.
Yep.
Any little movement around. But Fitz is the catalyst, and maybe the fool and the fool's friend, and maybe the fool was just trying to comfort him, or maybe because he was the catalyst and because Fitz made changes in the correct direction, it made the future for one brief moment only one path could happen or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I agree. I don't see this as the fool's typical philosophy. I don't see it as something that the fool preaches, at least not to my memory a lot. It feels like he's always talked about choice. Specifically, I'm brought to mind of when the fool meets Bee in the marketplace the very first time, and he shows her that you have to look further beyond in the path because
right.
if you change one decision, that leads to so many more outcomes.
Right.
And sometimes letting the bad things happen leads to a better outcome. That feels so much like a choice. I don't like, you have to let them make the choices, but sometimes you can nudge people into the right choices.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's like a supernatural force telling Burek to do this. I think this is what Burek decided to do because he loved Fitz as his son.
Right.
And I also think that it was like a science experiment for Chade. If it works, that'd be great.
I mean, also, I think you wanted.
I mean,
Fitz
yeah,
back,
he also cares about Fitz. I will not deny that Chade cares about Fitz, but I don't know. I don't like the idea that Fitz and the Fool in this moment, at least, think that this had to happen. There was no other way.
Right. I think a lot of this is the Fool looking back on these because he's talking. At least Fitz is talking from the future, about 10 years in the future or whatever.
Right.
So the Fool's looking back like, oh, we got to the Stone Dragons and saved the Six Duchies. This was the inevitable path for fate.
Right.
I needed this to happen, so we made it happen, and that's why they did it. It needed to be done. So I feel like if you talk to him in the moment about things, it's like, yeah, any little change can change things. Looking back on something that happened, oh, that needed to happen to get to where we are.
Right.
So that's where I'm kind of thinking it's at, where it's kind of his own. I don't want to say hypocriticalness because that's a little too harsh. It's not quite a juxtaposition either. It's just like him deluding himself a little bit about what is actually happening just so he can comfort somebody or himself about what had to happen to get to these points.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a interesting line for sure, and it did make me think a lot. So thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure how exactly I feel about it. And maybe it was just like you said earlier, the Fool trying to comfort Fitz. But I don't know. I think everybody has a choice, and
yeah,
I don't know. I like it better that way.
Well, we kicked off Assassin's Quest.
Yeah.
Starting the last book of the first trilogy here. What are you looking most forward to?
Girl on a Dragon.
Gotta wait a little bit for that one.
See you next year, guys. No, I really like the dragon stuff. I think when I first read this series, getting to the dragon part really confused me. I had so many more questions after getting there because it's like, this doesn't feel right. Like,
these aren't dragons like I know.
And then I was like, well, maybe it's just this is the version of the world's dragons. Then, the very next book, I'm like, I knew it. But yeah, I'm most excited to get to the dragons. I hate the start of this book mostly because of how sad Burek is about to get.
Yeah, how snappy and insulting Fitz is that he drives both Burek and Chade away.
It makes me really sad. I'm not looking forward to reliving that.
Yeah, it's an incredible tumultuous time for Fitz and for Burek and Chade.
But I think I'm also excited to meet Kettle because I think she's a cool character that I wish we got to spend more time with. What about you?
I like the part immediately after the beginning of this where he comes to himself and him and Night Eyes trek towards killing Regal.
Oh, right.
And Night Eyes goes by himself to try to join a wolf pack while Fitz goes in alone to try to kill Regal, and then Verity finds him and commands him to come to him. That whole sequence of 3 to 5 chapters, I don't know how long it is. It's really interesting to me, especially the little moments and the little things that I think it's right before he gets to Tradeford where he travels along with a minstrel and I think his 2 daughters or something like that, and kind of protects them, and the daughters are kind of wary of him, and the minstrel is blind or whatever, and he's like, hey, I could teach you if you want to protect us, because Fitz has a sword at that point. And Forged Ones attack, and he kind of like leaves them alone because he feels like he's drawing them towards these people. And I don't know, I think I like the little interactions with the common folk because we don't get that a lot.
That's fair, yeah.
In these books, and I like it a lot in other books of just getting like kind of who lives here and fleshing out the world a little bit more.
Not having to listen to the whiny rich boy for a couple seconds.
Right, yeah, exactly. So I think that's what I'm looking forward to, at least in the short term. The whole Verity sections are very interesting when they get to the quarry.
Yeah.
And like what Verity is feeling and trying to explain everything, because we know it's kind of happening, but everyone else is so confused.
Right.
So that's interesting too.
I think this book specifically, but the series as a whole, just reminds me that when I first read this, you had already read the series, and I would come to you with so many questions, and you would just give me a smirk and be like, well, you gotta keep reading, I guess. And I was always so frustrated. I just wanted answers. And I feel like this book is a big one where it gets to a point where it's just like, okay, but what are the answers? Tell me. And Robin Hobb, I think, does a really good job of building the tension and the suspense of how are we going to save the day? How is this going to get fixed? What's going on? And I'm excited.
That's true, actually. A lot of the first two books are plot-driven motivators to keep reading. Of like, oh, cliffhangers here. What's going to happen to Fitz? But the end of this book is a lot of, okay, what does that mean for the world? Like, what happened in the past? Like, what is the skill? What's the wit? Like, what is going on with this thing? What is this road? Who built this? Who is Kettle, and why is she 200 and some years old?
Right. Once we take out the court intrigue, I'm once again reminded, oh yeah, there's like lore, and I need to know what the heck these Elderlings are and why.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to the end of that too, so we can move on and then go to a different part of the world
and talk about some dragons.
Some live ships, actually.
Ooh, yes.
Also dragons, but you know, they don't know that yet.
Won't know that for quite a while.
Yeah, like 9 books or something. Actually, no, like I think more, 12 books, 13 books.
I don't know.
It's like in the last trilogy, I think they find out, so.
Yeah.
At least that they find out that they can still be revived to actual dragons. They find out that it's dragon, cocoons in the next trilogy. But anyway, thank you so much for joining us at the start of this book. I'm very excited to start Assassin's Quest off. It's a very exciting one. As I mentioned before, Royal Assassin is my favorite of the trilogy, but this does conclude it in a very solid way, and it has lots of exciting moments. So
yeah,
looking forward to reading more of it.
Very excited.
If you guys have any questions for us, any comments, any corrections, any thoughts of your own or theories, please reach out to us. Email us at isfitzhappy@gmail.com, or you can comment to us or message us directly, isfitzhappy, at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.